therefore, the reason why we're here tonight is to be, this program is called Community Engagement, Involved and Informed. That's why we're here tonight. We need to be involved and informed. This community, this Muslim community, this Somali American community, let there be no doubt that we're against violence, we're against extremism, a lot of isms, sexism, violence, we're against that. That to be clear tonight, we are. And we want what's best for our country, the USA. This is our country. This community will work with anyone who brings initiatives, ideas, programs that are against violence and extremism, provided that we're involved, provided that we're part of the process, provided that we can be consulted. So we'll move on, and I'd like to give the mic to the Executive Director of CAIR, Mr. Jailani, so he would continue the program. Thank you very much.
To some of the people here. But tonight we're here to talk about a very important topic, and I appreciate all of you for being here. Of course, the title is Minnesota's Counter-Violence Extremist Pilot Program, Understanding the Dangers of Reliance on Debunked Theory of Terrorism. And this program is really about education. And we want to really hope all of you here tonight get your questions answered. You know, our community, especially the Muslim community, is not a new community. Just the new immigrants are new. I mean, if we talk about the first Muslims that came here, it's reported that at least a third or even more of the population of the African American community that came here were Muslims. So Muslims have always been part of the American history, the American fabric. And today, it seems that we always forget this important aspect about the American Muslim community. It's not just these new immigrants with Somali spiced tea and bananas, but it is really about the long history that exists here in America. And so CAIR, I just want to give a little bit of announcements before we start. Like I said, the bulk of tonight's conversation is our guest here, who you heard their credentials, and we want to really hear from them because these are the experts when it comes to this conversation, and we hope that they can provide us some light about this conversation, but also to answer the questions that many of you have tonight. CAIR is the leading civil rights organization for Muslims in America, and the Minnesota chapter was started in 2007. And many of you here tonight, I know Lori, the former executive director, is here, the board members and others who have made this organization be what it is today. CAIR really is an opportunity I think all of you should learn. If you don't know all the details of what CAIR does, it's not just countering. So why are we here tonight? And I know this event has been covered extensively in the media. So I hope that for half of you maybe came here because you heard it on the news, but I know most of you are here tonight because of your relationship with CAIR. As you know, as CAIR, we've always worked with law enforcement agencies, and we've been a good partner in making sure that our community has those positive relationship with law enforcement. And just to give you an example, most of you have heard of the St. Anthony Abu Huraira case. How many of you have heard the St. Anthony Abu Huraira case? If you have not, there was a case regarding land use opposition, something that we have seen in Minnesota in a number of cases that we've defeated in Blaine and other cities, and even St. Cloud was one that did not come to a close. But the Abu Huraira case was something that CAIR got involved in very early on, a few years ago, and worked with the law enforcement agencies. And we were very happy to see that the U.S. Attorney here make a strong commitment and sue the city. And the picture is completely different. The day the Imam of Abu Huraira shaking the hands of the St. Anthony mayor, compared to the other days when when CAIR organized an opportunity for people to come and speak on behalf of the mosque, and you could see that there was a community that was divided. But hopefully, after that resolution, we look forward for a community that is working together. So we've always worked with law enforcement agencies. This program and tonight is not about bashing the government or in any way or form of that. It's about being conscious, being aware, being able to know how we interact with the law enforcement. And so I will let our speakers kind of introduce the topic a little bit more. They're going to talk a little bit in general about what has been happening across the United States, and specifically what are the conducts within the law enforcement agencies. But I just wanted to just preface one thing, and I just wanted to do that. Today we actually had a chance to finally at least CAIR to review the pilot program. We haven't had a chance since then, so today we had a chance to meet the staff there. I think some of them are here tonight. And to look at the program. Of course, we had our concerns and some things that we shared with them. They are not ready to share their program yet because it's still in development, and we respect them for that. And so tonight we're not going to talk about that program. We're going to talk about some of the other issues that we have already been talking about. And it's not just the CAIR Minnesota chapter that's presenting these issues. It is the ACLU, it is many organizations who have already talked about how law enforcement needs to do a better job in interacting with the Muslim community, particularly the Muslim community, and here in Minnesota, the Muslim community, and as well as the Somali community. So with that, I would like to get our panelists started. I will, of course, get a chance to make my CAIR speech down the line. So,
great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out, and thanks to Jelani and CAIR and the ACLU for bringing me out to talk about this issue. So the government, I should premise by saying that I am a firm believer that the government has a responsibility to do community outreach, right? They are our public servants, and the only way all aspects of government, but particularly law enforcement and Homeland Security, can understand what crime problems the community is facing and where they need assistance, and where law enforcement activities are actually harming innocent people within the community, is through engagement, and it's their obligation to reach out to the community to make sure that they are providing the services that all communities deserve, not just the Muslim community, but every community. And it's important that we use our public voice to hold government officials to account, to make sure that they are responsible for doing their job in an appropriate way. So I'm a big believer in community outreach, and I started working on this issue when I was at the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office, where we had done a nationwide FOIA and particularly got a lot of records out of Northern California. And looking at the community outreach program that the FBI was doing there, it started out as a perfectly appropriate activity. It was right after 9/11, and the Civil Rights Division of the FBI that does hate crimes initiated a mosque outreach program, where each field office was directed to identify where the mosques and Islamic centers were in their territory, so they could send an agent out to provide his business card to say, we work hate crimes. If there's some kind of reprisal or act of violence against you or your mosque or anyone in your community, call us, we're here to help. And that's totally appropriate, necessary work that the FBI did. And you have to keep in mind, in the course of doing that, of course, they identify where every mosque is and write down the person that they're talking to, and it's appropriate and necessary for them to do that, but it raises a concern, right? Because the FBI is also an investigative agency and an intelligence agency, and we want to make sure that when they're collecting that information for an appropriate purpose, they're not then misusing the information once they have it for other purposes. But what we saw in the documents is that this laudable outreach program in about 2005, 2006 started to morph a little bit, started to change a little bit, to where what we saw was in the FBI, you get rated every 90 days, and you have to basically argue your worth to your boss. What you've done this 90 days that justifies the taxpayer writing a check to you. So with the community outreach, they would have to fill out this long form, all the good things that they did, all the meetings that they had, the accomplishments that they have. And something was added, I want to say it was, I have a report online, but it was about 2006, that said, how has your outreach program assisted FBI investigative efforts and intelligence gathering efforts? So there, knowing the FBI from 16 years working, I realized that then puts pressure on a program that's designed for one purpose to start to use its resources towards these other purposes. And then we started seeing after that where we have FBI documents where outreach efforts were used to collect a lot of information about the people that they were talking to at the community events. Information that had nothing to do with any investigations, information particularly about their First Amendment activities, how often they prayed, where they were from, where their children go to school. Those sorts of things are collected in FBI files that are intelligence files, and right in the documents it said positive intelligence disseminated outside the FBI. So not just that it's being collected in intelligence files in the FBI, but actually disseminated outside the FBI. So that raises a lot of concerns from a civil liberties standpoint that it's infringing on your First Amendment rights. In fact, it's prohibited by the Privacy Act, and we tried to get the Inspector General of the Department of Justice to open an investigation. 23 members of Congress wrote a letter, but so far he has not. Then in 2008, the FBI created, their guidelines changed in 2008, and they created a program, an intelligence program called domain assessment or domain awareness. And in that program, they had an community outreach component. So here, the intelligence side of the FBI is now doing its own community outreach. The Joint Terrorism Task Forces also have their own community outreach. So for a community member to understand that the guy from the government coming to do community outreach isn't some friendly person from the Office of Public Affairs, but rather somebody from the Joint Terrorism Task Force or the intelligence community is very important, because the only way you can protect yourself and your community in your conversations with them is to ensure that you know what the purpose of that discussion is. To the FBI's credit, in 2010, they issued guidelines for their community outreach to segregate the records that they were pulling in to make sure that they aren't part of the intelligence apparatus, and that's a very positive development. It still authorized a lot of interaction between the community outreach and the field intelligence groups, but it was great that they recognized that there was a problem with doing that. But of course, what it would require is a lot more oversight. And what we found is, even months later, we still have FBI records where they're using this intelligence program domain management to continue to do community outreach. And when we talked to the FBI community outreach people about it in DC, they said, well, you know, our policies can only control our community outreach program. The intelligence program runs itself. You know, we don't tell them what to do. So there's still a concern in my mind that they're doing this. The Brennan Center for Justice also obtained documents pertinent to a program here in Minnesota, where the FBI in 2009 initiated what they called the Somali Community Outreach Team, SCOT or SCOT. And this program was combining community outreach with intelligence analysts, specifically for the purpose, at least one component of it, to collect information about vulnerable people within the community. So again, using this trust mechanism to instead collect intelligence that could be used that would possibly be harmful to the community. You may have read in the paper yesterday, an FBI spokesman said that although the document directs them to do that, they resisted that directive and didn't do it. And if that's true, that's terrific. I would want to make sure that we see some documentation to prove that. Reagan's old adage, trust but verify, I think comes into play in these things. And the fact that we do have records showing the FBI overstepped the rules, it's important to make sure that they are being followed and that we have some accountability, particularly since in June of 2014, the same FBI spokesman was quoted in the Minnesota Daily saying a large part of the FBI's outreach will be identifying at-risk youth. So it just raises questions that I think the community needs to understand how these programs have been misused in the past. So as a community, you continue these engagements, you recognize that there is some risk, and you have to do all you can to protect yourself and the communities you represent. And it really, number one is an education effort, which is why I'm here to help make you aware of where these programs have gone off the rail in the past, and also a know your rights issue, right? You have to understand that whenever you're engaging with law enforcement, what you say is on the record. I remember once as an FBI agent, I had somebody come up to me and say, I want to tell you this thing, but it's off the record, okay? I said, no, I'm not a reporter on the FBI. Everything you say goes on the record. I'll keep it confidential, but you can be sure that I'll be writing it down. So when you have these interactions, even if it is at a community event, there is some liability that can attach to that. So before you engage with the government, it's critical to get some legal advice, and particularly if you're talking about substantive issues, to have a lawyer with you when you're engaging with the government. And to the U.S. Attorney's credit here, he said in his outreach programs he's happy to have attorneys present. So he wouldn't see that as an affront at all, and that's entirely appropriate, and I applaud him for that. And I also applaud him for engaging with the criticism that we brought about these previous programs. But I think that there just needs to be a lot more transparency and a lot more awareness and a lot of answers to questions about how these past programs can be corrected. Because that information, if it was collected, or in Northern California where we know it's collected, how do we make sure that that's being taken out of the intelligence files and or segregated from the intelligence files?
Can you talk a little about the basic know your rights, as well as also explain what free move information?
Sure. So there are a number of legal groups. I know some National Lawyers Guild attorneys are here, the ACLU, CAIR, that do know your rights presentations that help you understand what your rights are when you have an interaction with law enforcement. And I think those are very important, and you should seek those out. There are cards you can carry that the ACLU produces. I think CAIR produces one too, that says what to do if you are contacted by a law enforcement officer. And again, it doesn't matter what that contact is, whether it's someone coming to your home, whether it's somebody coming to your workplace, somebody coming to the mosque, somebody at a community outreach. It's important to understand you are talking to a government official, and you have to make sure that you're protecting yourself and the other people that you're talking about. As far as the way the ACLU and the Brennan Center obtained all these documents where we got this information is through the Freedom of Information Act. And it's a very effective method. I find it's not nearly as effective as the subpoena power I had as an FBI agent. It takes a lot longer to get the documents, and you usually have to litigate in order to get the redactions removed so you can actually read the documents. So it creates a lag in what we know, right? So the documents that we're getting now have to do with 2009, 2010, 2011. We can't get records right now about programs that are going on right now. But it's possible for you to, particularly with Privacy Act requests. So if you have had interactions with the government and you want to know what information they collected, you can file a Privacy Act request, which is just like a Freedom of Information Act request, only it's on information about you, which often gets you more information, right? Because when the ACLU is asking for information about the community outreach program, the FBI has an obligation under the Privacy Act to protect the privacy of the people that are mentioned in the documents, so they would redact it much more heavily, where if you're asking for records about yourself or your own organization, they don't have that privacy concern and have to turn over more records. And when you do a Privacy Act request, those documents come to you. You don't ever have to publish them. You don't ever have to talk about them, but at least you know what information has been collected about you. And there are all sorts of exemptions that they don't have to provide all the records, but they usually at least have to explain why they're not providing you records. And usually, particularly if there's litigation going on, you can argue those. So it's an effective way of holding the government to account, so that we can make sure that the government is acting in an appropriate way.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Schanzer. I'm a professor at Duke University, and I've been studying this issue on and off since 2007, looking at methods and ways that we could prevent these kinds of incidents from happening again, whether they be acts of violence or people leaving our communities to join a foreign fighting force abroad. But I just want to say, first of all, how pleased I am to be here, and people here helped arrange my visit. So thank you to CAIR and Lori for helping to set that up. Been here talking to some of the people in the audience as part of my research activities, trying to understand the community's views and ideas in response to these efforts, these outreach efforts, but also we were able to talk about a wide variety of the challenges that are facing the community in the post 9/11 world. And I know it's a very diverse community. There's not one but many communities, both here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and across the region. And I just have felt very welcome, and has been very warm greeting, and I've really enjoyed spending this week with many of you and getting to know some of you. I hope I can come back maybe when it's a little warmer in the spring or summer. That would be nice. So also, as a matter of disclosure, as I said, I have been researching this on and off since 2007. A lot of my research has actually been funded by the United States Department of Justice. So that's a matter of full disclosure. I'm not an arm of the government. I'm not here speaking on behalf of the government. And anything I say in the research, I can't be penalized or have a freedom of speech in my research to say what I want. And I think I have a record of being a pretty fair, even-handed respondent, or else I probably wouldn't be getting grants from the government, but I also wouldn't be invited to speak here as well. So that's my disclosure, and you can all decide for yourselves whether you want to give credit to what I'm saying this evening. So I've been, the projects that I'm working on now are looking at two things. One is how local law enforcement is interacting with communities that might be at risk for recruitment to violent extremism, and then how the federal government is organizing around these ideas as well. And let me share with you, just in a very general way, some of the things of what we have found. There's a concept called community policing that's been going on in this country for quite some time. I think it really began to gain steam in the late 80s. And the idea behind community policing was that police should get out of their police cars and go out and meet and understand the public which they serve. And that the police is supposed to be here to serve you, the members of the public. You pay their salaries, you pay for the police cars, and they're here to provide public safety and make the entirety of the city where they are safe, and to prevent crime, and to so the idea was that we could not only respond to crime or other public safety. So it wasn't enough for the police to get a call and say there's a robbery occurring, go to the robbery, take the evidence, find the perpetrator, arrest them, put them in jail. That we, as a community, as a nation, would be much better off if we could work with communities, identify problems, try to understand why crime was occurring, address some of the root causes of public safety problems, bring resources to bear when appropriate, and that even though they're the police and they can arrest you, they could have a positive role to play in stopping crime from occurring. And it's been one of the most remarkable and least commented upon, social success stories in the United States over the last 20 years is the declining rates of violent crime. Now, there's still too much of it, and I'm sure you experience some of that here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. But there have been declining crime rates in this country for 20 years, and that means a lot less violence and drugs and violence in our streets, and that's a good thing. And a lot of people credit community policing techniques for that. So one of the things that we're finding in our research is that in the post 9/11 world, that police departments have been encouraged and sensitized that there are other communities that maybe they had not been touching as aggressively or reaching out to as much as they should have. A lot of more recent immigrant communities, whether they be from South Asia or here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, a very large Somali community. Now, let's not pretend that that's a coincidence. Obviously, it had to do with 9/11 and terrorism, but at least I come from the perspective that, hey, maybe these methods of working with the community, getting to know them, getting to know their issues, will help to deal not only with street crime or other forms of crime, but also to prevent the kind of violence that we've seen in 9/11 or in Boston, the Fort Hood shooting. If police and communities had stronger relationships, if they got to know each other, if they had trust, and trust in this endeavor is the coin of the realm. If the community doesn't trust the police are going to have a hard time doing their job. And if the police don't trust the community, they're not going to make any progress on these public safety issues. They're not going to get the information that they need to prevent crime at an earlier stage. So a lot of our discussions, and people in the room who I had a chance to chat with over the last couple of days can confirm, a lot of what we're talking about is what kinds of things can be done to actually build trust between the community and the law enforcement authorities. What are the grievances? What are the things that the police are doing wrong, seemingly pulling people over for no reason? What are the things that the federal government does? Delay people in the airport for 3 hours for years and years every time they leave and come back, and there's no transparency, no sense of an ability to get a remedy from this. So what are the senses of grievance that arise? But you know what? You hear from the government officials too that they have issues that they'd like the community to be more forthcoming, to try to trust them, that they're not there to and I'm not saying this that this is what's happening across the board, but you hear from government officials, if only somebody had said something about this person that they knew was headed in the wrong direction, we might have been able to help them. We might have been able to steer them in the right direction. We might have actually been able to prevent us from having to arrest them at the airport when they were going to go fight in the Syrian conflict, for example. I think I'll just wrap it up with that, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the other issues later on. I have to say, I don't agree with anything, disagree. I don't disagree with really anything Mike said. Sure, everybody has a right to be represented, and the government should be fully transparent. It is just wrong for anybody under the cloak of, hey, let's get to know you, I want to be my friends, let's have tea, let's learn to work on problems together, let's trust each other. I think government officials should be doing that, whether they're at the federal level or the local level. As we said, they are public servants. That means they are our servants. So I think those are great activities, and that's what should be happening, rather than people sitting behind their desk trying to solve problems from there. But you have every right to know what is the purpose of your interactions. And if people are saying they just want to get to know you to help you, but information is being used to collect possible evidence for criminal prosecution, that's a bait and switch. And bait and switches really don't work in any situation. It's the best way to damage trust. And so that the CAIR and Mike's organizations have every right to be asking those tough questions. And I think the government has an obligation to be transparent and to answer them as well. Because really, if they don't, then an initiative like the U.S. Attorney is trying to do here and in many other places around the country just will never work, because you won't garner the full trust of the community, and if we don't have the trust, then you won't have the cooperation and the cooperative effort to enhance public safety, which in the end, I think what this is all about. So thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to your questions, and I hope I can provide illumination on them.
I just we'll continue of the discussion, but before I call upon the next speaker who's sitting down there, from the Somali community's perspective, this is really unprecedented, and I've been here long enough, I've never seen any discussion or dialogue or in-depth information such as what we've seen tonight. And from our community's perspective, Somali community are really eager and trying to work with the authorities. And we have, because we got nothing to hide. We got nothing to hide. So that's from the Somali community's perspective. And we're looking forward to many other dialogues and discussions such as this one, because it'll create an awareness. It'll create perhaps, as David has just said, prevention. And also, it might even deter who would have been a troublemaker. So this is what we need. Let me call Professor Sheikh Hassan Jami'i, Imam of Masjid Da'wah, and also Professor of William Mitchell University.
The Muslims, which reflects to religion of Islam, as-salam means peace. First of all, although I wear a couple hats, the most important hat is Imam, as an Imam. And we have a couple Imams here tonight to be part of this discussion. And I'm not going to answer questions as experts are here today, are willing to answer those questions, but I'm trying only to share with you experiences that I have 2 nights ago with the Minnesota airports. But before that, let me make it very clear. We as imams, our role is da'wah role. Da'wah role. And da'wah role is teaching of Islam. That's our business. This is a legal business in America. It's under First Amendment to express your faith and practice wherever you are in America. And invite others to Islam. And when we do that, it's prohibited to use violence. It's a convincing business to ask, explain about Islam, and invite others to accept. We're not forcing, because Allah says in the Quran clearly, chapter number 2, La ikraha fi din, no compulsion on Islam. So for that reason, here the question of violence is out from this contest. For that reason, and let me add this joke, if anyone willing to accept Islam tonight, please let me know. But let me tell you that, disclaim, I won't be responsible after that if they put you the list that my friends talked about. But I pray for you that to go with me to paradise. Okay. Our community has, if you want to call like disadvantages after war on terror. I'm talking about the Muslim community in general, and then Somali community in particular. When they are new to this system, when they don't speak much about the language, the culture, the difference about the cultures, and also Somalis, where they came from and what's going in Somalia, and then also an organization which is part of the Somali organizations that listed as one of the terrorist organizations, which also reflects to the life of the Somalis there and here, when we come and when we leave, when it comes traveling. So what I do most of the time when I come back, I have some brochures and information to give the officers. I use an opportunity of da'wah. The last trip when I came back, I went to Rwanda for conference and then to Somalia. It was a 2-week trip. I just came back 2 days ago. And then I want to appreciate CAIR, first of all, the work that they have done in the past to teach the community their rights, to know what is their rights, what they should know all the time. And also it's important that to appreciate Mr. Lugar, Minnesota U.S. Attorney, the job that is doing or effort that is trying to put to coordinate the agencies with the community to build trust. But that takes long. As some imams knew, we had like 3 weeks ago one of the very important events, which is CBP, part of the Homeland Security, TSA, the imams, community leaders. We all came together to learn from each other. The goal was to get some trust between the government and the community. B, if there is a way that imams, especially the imams, and in general the Muslims, a way that the airport system, especially from the government, especially from the Homeland Security and TSA, that can ease the process when the Muslims land, especially the imams. And that never resolved. And one of the proof is the reason that I'm here tonight. I was held in the airport for 1.5 hours. And my assistant was waiting for me outside. He had a commitment with the 45 students, youth students, from Central High School, one of the critical speech about the role of the Muslim youth in America. That was blocked by the effort of the government. The government that is giving a message that they want to help youth live here in a positive way and become productive citizen. That government was responsible to miss that opportunity, those youth, to see me and meet my assistant and teach more about not only Islam, how to be productive citizen and helpful citizen in that age, important, critical age, in the high school before they go to the college. So that's where my friends are saying we should find out ways to resolve this. There are policies sometimes are unique, helpful as a policies to avoid any harm to the United States. But at the same time, when it comes application, it's, you see, like unfair application on the imams, on the Muslims. If you saw that day, that afternoon, that room were full of the Muslims. Not only that, the long and the length of the process. So, thanks Mr. Lugar, he called me today and showing that, or sharing with me that how he was very upset what I faced and the missing opportunity with the youth by my assistant. So finally, dear friends, this effort to save our country here, I always say I have two countries, Somalia and the United States, requires collective effort, requires honest effort. Honest effort. I use that language as many times I could use. If we are honest to each other, it will be very easy to come a solution that helps the whole society and the country. But if one of the projects is to use gathering intelligence, and I want to say this also, disclaim for my community especially and the Muslim community in large, masjids and Muslims, we are not part of any intelligence gathering activities because it's not our job, it's not our businesses. I know some time we had a meeting with Mr. Lugar and we had a very important discussion that we can build trust and relationships. But when it comes, a specific job is each one of us has to do its job. We must do our da'wah job. Teaching people about Islam, bridging between Muslims and non-Muslims in a peaceful manner, and so on. And government has to do their job to find who is a criminal and do their own investigation in a proper and legal manner. And that was the discussion. And that's what I hope should continue, and each one of us will play the proper role. And thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Imam Sheikh Hassan Jami'i, and we're sincerely touched your situation, and hopefully that can change soon. We'll get to the next phase of the program, which is the Q&A, questions from the audience. As I said, as I alluded before, this is really new to us in terms of our community, this gathering and this in-depth information, or as I said, this program, it's about community engagement and getting involved and getting informed. So therefore, I'm going to come back to you as questions, and hopefully our panel of experts. As a matter of fact, let's give them a hand again, please. Let's give them a hand. This is David and Jailani, as well as Michael, as well as Imam Sheikh Hassan Jami'i. We are grateful that you're here tonight. From the audience, your questions, I'm hoping and I'm asking you, and with respect, to be specific on a question, not a comment, due to the time and due to our guest. Whoever has a question, to be on the topic on hand. Nothing to do about other topics, the topic on hand tonight. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to give you the microphone. Be specific and please be prompt. And state your name, and if you have a title or what have you, please.
3 questions at a time.
Yes, sir. Come here.
Comments are welcome.
Comments are welcome. I'm overruled.
You're overruled.
Okay. CAIR.
My name is Jamal Omar. My question actually has to do with a current case that is going on here in Minnesota. It's the case of Abdullahi Yusuf. Recently, a judge has just released him out of custody. He had tried to buy a ticket to go to Turkey and then possibly to Syria. So the judge released him into the custody of a halfway house. And on the media report today, it said that they're going to do one-on-one counseling. They cut off him all ties to the outside community, and that they also want to consider doing de-radicalization curriculum. Now, this terminology kind of raises questions in my mind. Who is checks and balancing this curriculum, and are there Muslims involved in the process of this? And this is one of my concerns, and so I'd just like for you guys to share a little bit on that, God willing.
Brother Abdullah, thanks. The next question. You want to? I thought you said 3 questions.
The rules keep changing.
Okay.
Thank you for that question. And actually, one of the attorneys in that case has recently asked me to make clear. In that case, the judge has created a creative set of requirements for pretrial release. And that community effort has nothing to do with the community outreach that we're talking about today. So I want to make that clear. And I don't know a lot about that particular case, so if I can talk more broadly about radicalization and counter-radicalization training, because this is a critical thing for the community to understand, is that this is a concept that is very misunderstood. And unfortunately, the government, in many different ways, adopted this very simplistic model of radicalization for how a person goes from being, as they say in their materials, a normal person to becoming a terrorist. And they theorized this simple 4-step process where a person adopts an ideology, they become active in the ideology, and then 4th step, become a terrorist. So the idea is going left of boom, and that's what has driven. So the NYPD had one of these reports, which is what drove, I believe, the spying program, because if you know all the terrorists come from this community, then of course that drives your effort to surveil that community. There are a couple of problems with the radicalization theory. One is that it identifies First Amendment protected activity as indicators of dangerousness. So when you look at those reports, they identify things like adopting Muslim, number 1, converting to Islam or practicing Islam, 2, adopting Muslim dress, 3, growing a beard, so you're in trouble. But be careful, because shaving your beard is actually another indicator, believe it or not. And it's funny when you read it, but there are people in the government who actually believe these things, that and basically the way it breaks down, the more religious you are in this model, the more dangerous you are. There's the other problem with it, other than the impact on suppression of First Amendment activities, is that there's not an empirical basis to support this. That when you see empirical studies of terrorism, they do not support the idea that there's a simple 4-step method of becoming a terrorist. In fact, there is no profile, there is no pattern, there is no predictable pathway. One person might follow this, but another person is going to follow a completely different trajectory. And that's one of my major problems with this whole, what they're calling countering violent extremism. In 2011, was it I said 2010. The Obama administration released a strategy for countering violent extremism that embraced community outreach as a method of countering violent extremism. So it was no longer that we're doing community outreach because we recognize that you are part of the constituency we are here to serve, and we need to understand what your needs are, but rather we're going to do this because we view you as the suspects. And that's really a big problem with the framing of all countering violent extremism programs because they only focus on one community, right? When I was in the FBI, I went undercover in violent neo-Nazi groups, in violent anti-government militia groups. Unfortunately, there are many different types of people of very different ideology who commit acts of violence to further their political goals, right? Terrorism is not a Muslim issue, but this program, this countering violent extremism, focuses only on the Muslim community and reinforces this belief that unfortunately is present in American society, that terrorism is a Muslim issue. And in fact, again, empirical evidence shows that isn't true. You know, the numbers of deaths every year from terrorism in the United States is far more people are killed by far-right extremists than any other kind of extremists, yet we don't treat that the same. And in fact, even when we have a CVE program, the only community it's directed to is Muslims. So it just increases that stigma, so that's part of the problem. And because there's no pathway of, quote, radicalization, it's hard to understand how de-radicalization works, right? So, you know, because again, the concept that the government has in this model is that it's somebody has dangerous ideas and then they become a violent person, where that's not what it is. I mean, with the neo-Nazi groups I worked, you know, there were some guys who were, you know, very steeped in the neo-Nazi ideology. There were other people who liked to make bombs, and that's why they were there. And they didn't really know anything about the ideology. They were just criminals who liked to make bombs, and this was a group that supported that hobby. So, you know, terrorism is a very complex problem. You know, it is an issue we want the government to address. It's an issue that, as David's work and the Triangle Center in North Carolina has shown, the Muslim community is good about reporting people they know are problems, and many of the prevented terrorist attacks come from tips from the Muslim community, as we all know. So it's not an issue of the community not engaging with law enforcement. So, you know, a lot of what drives this is these sort of fraudulent problems, and rather than coming to the community and addressing all your problems, all your crime problems, you know, one thing I talk about a lot is that, you know, the number of deaths from terrorism is a tiny fraction every year of the 14,000 plus murders in this country, right? There's a lot of violence in our society. And I learned coming here that there are 20 unsolved murders in the Somalian community, victims. So my belief is that we create a safer society from all kinds of violence if we address crimes that are actually occurring. You know, in the United States, half of violent crime isn't solved. A third of the murders aren't solved. 60% of the rapes aren't solved. Here in Minnesota, they're a little bit better on homicide. I think it's 69%, but actually worse in rape cases. So there are a lot of crime problems in the community we can talk about in an outreach program. But if the government makes the outreach program only about terrorism and only about one community, that actually creates a stigma that reinforces this flawed belief that Islam and terrorism are linked. Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me say a word first, I guess, about the notion of the Obama administration strategy in 2011. I don't think it's entirely, I agree with Mike most of the time, but not all the time. So I don't think it's entirely fair to say that it was a strategy that was saying, well, we're going to engage and have better community relations just so we can solve the terrorism problem. Did it come up in the context of terrorism? Well, of course it did. But we have had a number of incidents which unfortunately get much more media attention than they should. It gets, I've written many articles talking about how the threat is really overhyped compared to a lot of the other public safety issues. But you know, if you're a public official, if you're the President of the United States, you can't totally discard the environment in which this occurs, or the overreactions of the American public and what is happening in the media. So I just don't think it was inappropriate to say, hey, instead of making our approach towards counterterrorism only about investigation, spying, and arrests, let's try to do something proactive. Let's try to actually build stronger public safety nets, and cooperative efforts with communities, with the hope that if we did that, that we could deal with crime problems, that we could deal with gangs, but we could also try to reduce the likelihood of violent extremism. So I think that's a nuanced difference in view, but I think it's an important one. The second point I want to make, and I think this goes to the questioner at least a little bit, is the concept of intervention. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, you know, law enforcement, whether it be local police or U.S. Attorney and the FBI, have a lot of discretion about when to say this person has crossed the line and we're going to arrest them. Believe it or not, there is a lot of things that could be considered criminal actions where the line is technically crossed, but for a variety of reasons, the government might decide not to execute an arrest, but might try to do other things to persuade that person, hey, if you turn back, if you stop engaging in these activities that are criminal or appear to be building towards an even bigger criminal offense, you know, you have a chance to stay out of jail, essentially. So in a lot of these CVE programs, and let me also say there's no such thing as the CVE program. Every one of these efforts is different, whether it be at different levels of government, local versus federal, and it's different in different places. But one concept in CVE is, okay, let's take one of these traveling cases. Somebody is interacting with a known ISIS member abroad on the internet. They are doing so frequently, and they are saying how they want to join the fight. They take concrete action towards, and since ISIS is a named terrorist organization, helping them in any way is a crime. Helping them with your labor, helping them by sending money, helping in any way can constitute a crime. They say, you know, I'm going to get ready to travel over there, and I'm going to bring you certain types of materials that you need. I'm going to bring a bunch of laptop computers with me when I come. Then they go and buy 10 laptop computers. Now, it's not a crime to buy 10 laptop computers, but it is a crime to buy one for ISIS. And then let's say that the FBI learns about this, and it's and otherwise a good person who just has really fallen into some stupid activities. The question is, can we do some sort of intervention with that person? Can the community, can talking with the imam, can maybe trying to deal with some mental health or issues that are other psychological issues that might be going on with this person that maybe led them to be vulnerable to believing that this was a good idea to travel to Syria and to fight for ISIS. Lots of people are trying to think, and I'm sure the U.S. Attorney, this is part of their program as well, how can we create some models where government and the community can work together to try to intervene with these people. So there's some alternatives to a strictly law enforcement arrest and incarceration model for dealing with perpetrators. Your question was not exactly like that, because this person had apparently committed a crime, otherwise he wouldn't be in detention, or at least was suspected of committing a crime, or there was good probable cause, or else they wouldn't have been in detention. And so they're trying to, it's another kind of intervention that was called de-radicalization, but I think it's a different kind of intervention to see, can we turn this person to a different path? Can we get confidence that they're going to change their ways and not engage in criminal activity, and therefore not have to prosecute them and put them in jail for 15 years, which is what you've seen, unfortunately, in many instances here. So that's my point.
As you can see, the answers are long, and the reason why the answers are long is because the questions are complex as themselves. So I think we have one speaker, and then we can do the questions.
Yes, let me go down again. Who's Brother Aman? Come down here. And, yeah, his hand was up till yesterday. I know you can speak, but get to the point. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. The question is for you, sir. We've been hearing that part of this new CVE program that the District Attorney's Office will be doing is they're going to bring in some funds for the community, and we do appreciate any funds that will enhance our socioeconomic status. My concern is there a way that our community organizations and our community advocates could receive these funds to further enhance our livelihood without having strings attached? Meaning, or is there a model you suggest where they could get money to continue to do work on behalf of the community without feeling coerced to, intelligence gathering?
So I appreciate the question, and I'm afraid my answer is going to be not sufficient enough. I'm not an expert in what the community should do. So I can provide you information about how these programs have been abused in the past that you can use to come collectively to your own decisions how you want to address these issues. One of the things I suggest you read is the United Kingdom House of Parliament, House of Commons, I think, put out a report on a similar CVE program that was done in Britain. This is not new. It's something that was brought over from Britain, where they used funds, and the problem that occurred was, and if you read even some of the FBI documents about the Scott program, part of the goal of these CVE programs, and again, the new programs in development, we don't know what it is, but look at the past to protect yourself as these move forward, is to identify individuals and groups who will repeat government messaging, right? So people who support government policy and basically will become spokesmen for the government within the community. And the idea of the way they used the funding was to reward those groups that said positive things about government policy and deprive groups that challenged government policy and or raised concerns with civil liberties. And in some of the supporting documentation you'll see for this CVE model, the Bipartisan Policy Center is one. What they identify, and this is where I think David and I's, my subtle disagreement is in what is identified as a threat, right? I mean, I would agree if any of you know somebody who's making a bomb or preparing weapons or going to hurt somebody, I urge you to go to the police immediately and work with the police. And even if somebody has mental health issues, that's just part of being a community, is that we try to help the less fortunate and the needy within the community. But what these models suggest is that the mere expression of grievance against the government is an indicator of future violence. So they will identify even complaining about violations of civil liberties makes you suspect. So when you start doing the intervention methods for people who are simply expressing opposition to government policy, that's when what you're actually doing is suppressing their First Amendment rights and suppressing the conversation. right? I mean, these cases that come up don't come up in a vacuum. There are conflicts around the world that are driving a lot of this, and that part of it is rarely in the discussion of CVE. We sort of turn a blind eye. We're not looking at this horrible military intervention that's going on, where, you know, on all sides of the conflict there are atrocities, and you could understand why any feeling person would want to do something to prevent those atrocities in the conversation. So it, you know, they instead try to pretend that anybody who wants to go overseas, anyone who has a problem with the government policies, must have some defect. You know, there must be something wrong with him. And if they're Muslim, maybe there's something wrong with Islam, or maybe it's some mental defect within the community that makes them vulnerable. You know, I hate that language, that they're vulnerable to recruiters. You know, it's not what stands up to empirical scrutiny about what actually drives people to engage in these things. And I'm all in favor of your communities getting more money for all sorts of good social purposes, but tying that to a counterterrorism method, I think, is somewhat dangerous and risky, and just want to make sure that you understand how these previous programs were abused so you can protect yourself as they move forward. Sorry.
I will be brief, but I think in my hypothetical, the First Amendment doesn't cover your right to buy 10 laptops and bring it to, and I think I was trying to be very careful in constructing my hypothetical, that I was talking about action and not ideas.
Right.
And I agree with Mike 100% that everybody in this room has a right to believe that the American foreign policy is messed up, to disagree with the way the Israel-Palestine conflict is being handled. I agree with that, actually, in a number of ways. And so it is inappropriate, in my view, to start an intervention model or to claim somebody is headed down the path towards radicalization because they have ideas that are not consistent with what the American government would like them to be, whether it be about U.S. foreign policy, or frankly, everybody has the right to believe that the West is at war with Muslims, which is what bin Laden's rallying cry is. And you have every right to believe that. You just don't have a right to take any sort of action that is violent or against the law in any way to further those ideas. And none of these activities, this intervention model, what I described, de-radicalization programs, you shouldn't be CVE'd because you have bad ideas, but it has to be limited to conduct. And I think that is a very, very important thing as governments go along in constructing their programs, that number one, they have to draw that line very clearly, and they have to be very transparent that with the communities that they are serving, that they believe that that is where the line is going to be drawn. As for the money, I think you raise a really tricky issue, and I think these U.S. attorneys are trying to iron through that. Because who's at the table, how the money would be distributed. You know, remember, once money starts flowing around, that's when things can get messy. And we have a whole lot of, in the grant-making process, whether it be local or the federal government, about transparency and fairness and everybody getting an opportunity to apply and only the best proposals. It shouldn't be just the groups that a U.S. attorney happens to like that get the funds. Everybody should have an opportunity to apply, and there should be a fair process based on the merits of the proposal and which ones will best serve the community, which ones are most likely to meet the objectives, whether it be about employment or about youth activities or things like that. It should all be about the merits of the proposal and not who you are and your willingness to, quote, cooperate with the government that decides who gets any funding.
Quick thing, it's about the money issues and funds. it's a very important to have a frank discussion or debate between the community and also and the government, between the community themselves about these issues, because sometimes it goes to the issue of ideology. When it comes to ideology, as my friend said, it's a very important, even like ideology related to the foreign policy of the United States, ideology related about even jihad, ideology related about understanding of the Islam and what's going on between West and East and all this. There is a model called like Ibn Abbas model. I don't want to discuss here, but that model was used the time of the Ali bin Abi Talib when the president of Ali had a conflict with a group that was called Khawarij that was about to use force to throw the government, but that was resolved between the debate between that group and the scholars of the Muslims. And my friend was just asking about the intervention, a point that he made, I agree. Until now, I have many imams here. No imams was consulted about how this program will work. And this program, I think, if we want to have it like as effective as it will be for the interest of the community or the nation, it has to be like debate. And that debate should be should go to all aspects, looking all aspects, political, ideologies, and all this. And I think we can come to the conclusion that is it right way to fund and which money and how and where and all this. Otherwise, we keep saying like we should get funded. Where it will go this money? What will be used? And all these questions will be raised.
Okay, I just wanted to also add something. I'm not just passing the microphone, I'm also part of this conversation. I just wanted to reiterate, and I'm glad you mentioned the British CVE, and we've been also aware of this, and CAIR National has been looking at this because the current pilot programs are focusing on those 3 cities in Boston, in Minnesota here, and also in LA. And in all those 3 communities are completely different. So there's also a complete different focus in how the relationship between the law enforcement agencies and the community that lives there. Obviously, Minnesota is, we know that the large community here are Somalis. But specifically, the British program, one of the issues, actually an author named Arun Kandani observed something unique about that program, which he mentioned that the government is sponsoring Muslim organization on the basis of theological criteria, not just even who's going to support the government on its agenda, but also on theological. So he said, for example, holding Sufis to be strictly more moderate than Salafis. So even getting into the Muslim community and dividing on the basis of theological. So this is one of the things that happened there in Britain. And going back to the initial point, the purpose for tonight is really for all of us to recognize that this conversation, as you heard, we need to be a community that is completely aware of what's happening. And I'm going to share with you that the Brennan Center put together a masterpiece really about talking about some of the programs, and specifically in Minnesota. And we have a document back there just for you to look at, and maybe at the end, if there's some left, you can take one home. And then also the other documents. I mean, I understand some of you have never heard of what SCOT is. This just came up very new. You know, the FBI already said this is in Minnesota. They said, we're not doing this. And we'd like to see some proof of that, other than just them saying it, because they said in June, as Mike mentioned. So even that program, you could get a chance to read. And as Mike also mentioned, all of you, if you feel that you need to request information from the FBI, you have that right, and we do that. And I just want to go back to at least what CAIR does and what the CAIR chapter really sees on a daily basis. We have people who come to our office who have been interviewed by the FBI. And it gets to a point where, at least for one individual that I know, he has a paranoia. He literally has a paranoia. He was interviewed by the FBI. But before they interviewed him for a whole month, they kept going around his community and showing his picture to everybody. Have you seen this guy? Have you seen this guy? And then eventually when they had the interview with him, they didn't find nothing. But from that instant till today, he's still suffering from some sort of, a feeling that they're watching. We have a community. We have to recognize these programs elevate the anxiety within the community that we live in. We have a case where a young man was learning English in his English school, and then he pulled up a book and he wanted to learn how to become a taxi driver. And any of you taxi drivers know you got to learn maps before GPS came, right? But anyways, you need to know maps. And he was reading a maps, and his teacher thought of all the conversations that are taking place, this man is preparing himself to do something. And he reported him to the local police, but it didn't stop there. That man also, that report went from the local police to the FBI. And he had the FBI watching him and following him. So we have to talk about these programs when we talk about the real stories. We only get few of the brave ones who call to CAIR and come to our office. There are a large number of people within our community who once the law enforcement come through outreach or without the other outreach, that they crumble. So this is a really serious conversation that we're having today. But I think that's something that we have to put some relevancy behind that. I know my friend Bruce Nestor wanted to make a comment. I forgot. Please, Bruce, if you can come on up from the National Lawyers Guild.
So I might just want to pick up from some of the comments that Jelani was just making, because I don't pretend to have really some of the big picture understanding. I haven't read all the documents and don't have the understanding that the Brennan Center might have. I haven't studied it, and I don't participate in law enforcement and have the perspective maybe that someone from the government does. But as an attorney in Minneapolis for the past 12 years, I see impacts of the FBI activity on a number of Somali clients that I have represented. Overwhelmingly young men who are approached by the FBI and are asked to come to a coffee house or come to a meeting or are asked questions. And my overwhelming perspective is that they are not people with specific information about any type of criminal activity. And what I'm always told, were they to possess that information, they feel both a moral and an ethical duty to share that because they don't support violence. But they've been approached for some other reason, and sometimes I may not know what they are. Sometimes it's because they have expressed opinions on politics or foreign policy that aren't consistent with what the government has. And I've often written letters to the FBI saying, "Dear FBI agent, I represent this individual. This individual doesn't want you knocking on their door, coming to their place of work. But if you have specific questions for them, give me a call, we'll sit down and we'll talk." And I've never once gotten a response from the FBI saying, we really believe this person has real information that we need as part of an investigation. And my perspective then is that this is an intelligence gathering. It's trying to develop informants. I have a client from Jordan who was applying to become a citizen. And before the Holy Land Foundation was made illegal in 2000, he made donations at his mosque to the Holy Land Foundation out of his moral obligation to support charitable work. And he was threatened that if he did not become an informant, that he would have trouble with his naturalization application, which he has had now for many years. I represented an Islamic after-school program which allowed an individual who was under indictment by the government to be physically present at the school. And there was testimony in court from a military veteran who had been a veteran, served in the U.S. military for 20 years, that he had 4 children at this school, that if he ever, and he was there on a daily basis, this veteran was there seeing what his children were learning, and that if he had any information that any violence was being advocated or planned or helping, encouraging people to go overseas, that not only would he report it, but his children wouldn't be there. And yet there was FBI surveillance of this school that then caused people to pull their children out because they were afraid to be associated with it. There was comments made by members of the U.S. Attorney's Office as well as the district court bench that dangerous activities were happening at this school without any foundation in fact. And again, so my impression, and I contrast that to public statements I hear from the U.S. Attorney's Office, from district court judges, from elected officials, praising the unprecedented cooperation and outreach being carried out by law enforcement with the Somali community and how positive it is. That's not been the experience that I have seen as a practicing lawyer. And I think I'll just close my comments. I am a member of the National Lawyers Guild. I have a perspective that, in my belief, we have had a growing national security state in the United States ever since, primarily after World War II, with a massive growth in the nature of internal security forces and the projection of force and violence overseas by the United States government. And that the dialogue around terrorism and some of what Mr. German was saying, which focusing on a particular type of violence, which is responsible for a very small percentage of the violence, that the discussion we're having about terrorism and about countering it with these programs is really about creating a climate that continues to justify this national security state, in growing surveillance and internal security in this country, and the projection of violence and force abroad by the United States government. And that's not something that I support. I want to have a peaceful society at home and abroad, and at that point, I oppose programs that target a certain community and use law enforcement to try to provide social services.
Thank you, Bruce Nestor from the National Lawyers Guild. Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to the Q&As. This gentleman was had raised his hand, and if you could please make it brief.
My name is Ali Reda. My question is directed to the normal citizen who is part of the Arab Muslim community who lives here. What's that? Speak up. Okay. How do I handle the people around me? Now, when I learn my rights when dealing with authorities and I exercise them, that raises the ires of others. This becomes more dangerous. It's much easier to talk to Muslims about it, and I agree with what you said, even if I believe that the policy of the United States is immoral. However, my religion requires me to honor وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَعَهْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ. That's part of the Quran. It requires me to honor my agreements with others. My agreements with the United States is to uphold the law here. I cannot take you're wrong, then I'm going to blow it up. That's not my privilege. So that's what I tell the people I know, and I think this is a word that can be stressed in from all the imams. When the American citizens cite all the things that Muslims do, and they use the title Muslims, and I have to be very careful how to answer them in that without raising their ire. And the simplest thing I can say is the title Muslim does not mean what Islam professes. So don't mix that with that. But however, when dealing with authorities, what I heard is that I have rights. In my own heart, I thought that I can say anything as long as I didn't do anything wrong, but it looks like I'm undermining my rights. I don't know how to reconcile it, so I need somebody to comment on that. Thank you.
How do I know my rights and about labeling Islam a Muslim?
I think that's a very good question, and I think it brings upon 2 points maybe. Number one, as you can tell, the conversations around this program, even itself that we're talking about, there was a summit that is planned for February, I think sometime down in February, but that same summit was actually planned in October, and then it was scratched. And then after the France incident, four days later, the program or the summit was actually reissued. So there is also a lot of politics in how these programs are discussed in the open and in public. You know, the government people are asking, what are you doing to counter extremist violence? Or we have this program. So it's not even about actually law enforcement, good practices, something behind theories, but it's really just sometimes also the nature of how politics is being played. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. But the question that you asked is, how do we continue have that dialogue? I started with earlier today that, the Muslim American story is not about the Somalis that came to Minnesota. One of the interesting things about the Midwest is there's a little town called Ross, North Dakota. Most people don't know, but there's a mosque there. And that was built in the 1900s by Arab Muslims. In Minnesota, we have record that in the 1800s, there Muslims were here. And in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, one of the oldest mosques. So Muslims have been part of this community for a very long time. But we have this amnesia that every time something happens, we have to restart the conversation, we have to restart the narrative. And I think the responsibility is for everybody to wake up and to really change the narrative of this discussion. And that's something that I think all of us need to play a role. It is not just CAIR who, we do our part, but everybody needs to play that role. But I think there's another thing that you mentioned, which is why many of us have a difficult or different viewpoint to how government and especially law enforcement works. For most of us, if you come from Somalia or, for example, Egypt or any of the, you come from what we consider a police state. And in that type of mentality, you often think that there is police, they say in Egypt, all the walls have ears, which means that somebody's watching, somebody's listening. And so one of the reasons why even the census data that is collected in 2010 was not very accurate toward the minority community, and it's not just the Somalis, is because when you come and you say, here's a paper, put your name down, and this is the first time I've interacted with you, and you haven't explained something to me, most people are going to say, oh, well, what are you asking? My name, all of this information, and people start saying, no, that's okay. We'll do it later. We'll come back, right? And that's true, and that's because of that fear that exists within a community that believes that everybody's talking to each other. And to be honest with you, that case that I just shared with you where a young man who's just learning how to become, just picking up, where all the immigrants have come, learn English, go to school, work hard, become a taxi driver, then how do you tell him that all the walls don't have ears when the teacher who has really no legal law enforcement background just connected a Muslim maps? He's doing something wrong with the maps. This is the kind of narrative that exists. And these programs, when this program, the pilot program was addressed, it was right after September 11. They could have been a much more sensitive date to talk about this program, but it was announced by the Attorney General on the eve of September 11. And some of the other programs were also announced within time period of arrest. So, this is also political. We have to recognize that. I think that's a very important point to point out.
Honored to be here, beautiful night with a lot of people. Talk loud? Okay. So my name is Asido Shai, or Saido Shai in Somali, and I'm a member of the Somali community. And some of the things that I was hearing tonight from you and all the people who were asking questions just raised an eyebrow for me, because I'm serving on the Juvenile Justice Advisory Council as being appointed by the governor, and there is another initiative called Cultural and Ethnic Communities Leadership, and that is to reduce disparities. And when we talk about all these issues, it just becomes like there's a question mark in everything. And as a citizen, you ask yourself, is there actually a line? You were talking about crossing a line, and I don't see that line. Is there actually a line? Because when we see as a community members, there's many things happening within the community person because so-and-so who say I'm a Muslim did something. And you have the majority of people who are law-abiding citizens who are willing to do what is right for their country, just like I am doing and just like you're doing. So my question to you is, one, if there is a line, I don't see that line clearly from all perspectives in terms of you guys and the law. That's one area. And the second area is all the things that is happening within the community you're talking about it goes to the back of a woman. So as a woman, as a mother raising children, I see many things that's happening within the community that the women are not there. They're not representative. They're not represented. And many of the things that's happening, as a man, my child just turned 12 years old. And so every time I see all this, I just think about 5 years from today, where will my child be? And what would be the alternatives? Because I feel that I've been called, just like any other mother, to do something for that cause. And so my question to you is, so we see this is, I see that whatever is happening in the community, from the FBI, from law enforcement, is not maybe talking to me, or you guys maybe not talking to me. So I am confused at this moment, and I don't understand what is cooking.
I'll be brief. My name is Nasser, and I always love to make people yes or no. My question is very quick. Currently, I'm working with Humphrey Policy Fellow. We are looking at specifically de-radicalization program, specifically how effective it is or how it's not effective. But we are focusing on from what we understood is that there's a lot of focus on the before somebody become radicalized or pre-radicalization. We're not looking at post-radicalization, but we look at try to understand what does it really mean for somebody who become radicalized, and how can we get to that person and decriminalize that act and then reintegrate them into community. That's what we're looking for.
Thank you. All right, there we go. Thanks.
So again, these terms, radicalization, de-radicalizations, are fraught with all sorts of freight that a lot of the empirical studies don't justify, right? I mean, when they interview actual terrorists who have committed terrorist acts, they're often not very ideological. They're not driven by some interpretation of anything. It's that there's a conflict going on and they knew so-and-so who they liked and trusted. Maybe he was a family member, maybe he was a friend, and they went along with what he did. There are others who are looking for adventure. This concept that there is some ideological virus that gets into your head and makes you do bad things isn't supported empirically. So, there's a guy, John Horgan, up at University of Massachusetts, who has argued that we should scrap the term radicalization and de-radicalization and talk about disengagement from terror groups, and that would be a more useful term. How do we convince people who have engaged in terrorism or engaged with terrorist groups to disengage from those terrorist groups? Their ideas don't have to change. If you look at how terror groups actually end, one of the primary ways is through political reconciliation, right? In Northern Ireland, the IRA, people who were the IRA are now the government, right? Their ideas didn't change. Their radical ideas are now part of the government. So it's not about changing radical ideas. That perhaps talking about disengagement might be more useful, and I look forward to seeing more of his research. Again, it's John Horgan, right?